Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. It had been almost 8 years since Lila had last seen Theo Dot back then. He was a bright but anxious intern at the publishing house where she worked, all wide eyes and nervous energy. Eager to learn, always scribbling notes as if every word she said might change his future. She was 10 years older, confident in her career, unsure about everything else. Their bond had been easy, natural, professional mostly, but occasionally, when their hands brushed, or when he looked at her like she was some rare novel he couldn't stop reading, something lingered between them, unspoken and respectfully buried. Now they stood across from each other at a literary conference in Seattle, both older, changed, and somehow still tethered by something invisible. "Lila," he said, stunned. "I didn't expect—" She laughed, softer than she used to. "Neither did I. You've grown." "And you haven't." Aged A, he was taller now. His shoulders broader, posture more grounded. His smile hadn't changed, boyish and thoughtful, as if always holding back a secret. Over coffee, they caught up on years apart. She had gone through a divorce. He had published 2 novels. They both had stopped believing in timing. Later, that evening, they found themselves walking along the harbor. The breeze cool, conversation easy. They talked about the books that changed them, the people who hurt them, the versions of themselves they no longer were. "I used to be terrified of you," he admitted, hands tucked in his coat pockets. "You were so sure of yourself." She glanced at him. "I wasn't. I just knew how to look like I was." There was silence. Not awkward, just thick with possibility. When they parted, he hesitated. "Would it be strange if I asked to see you again? Properly?" She smiled. "It would be strange if you didn't." What followed wasn't sudden, but it was certain. They began talking regularly. Long phone calls, thoughtful text, voice notes at midnight about poetry and fear and the strangeness of starting over in your 30s. When he came to visit her in Portland 3 weeks later, she met him at the station with coffee and a scarf. She remembered he always forgot Dot in her apartment that evening. After hours of talking, laughter softened into stillness. They sat on the couch, knees touching. He reached for her hand, tentative, unsure. She didn't pull away. "You're shaking," she whispered, feeling the tremor in his fingers. "I know. I used to mentor you. I know that too. And now?" He looked into her eyes. Steady, reverent. "Now I just want to know you." When he kissed her, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't wild. It was tender and grateful, as though he had waited a long time to touch something fragile without breaking it. And when they made love later, slowly, with quiet reverence, it didn't feel like crossing a line. It felt like writing anew. One, not because of lust, but because of trust. Because something that began in guidance had transformed, through time, growth, and distance, into something mutual and whole. They didn't move too fast. Lila was cautious. Theo was patient. There were hard conversations about past relationships, about imbalance, about fears of being misunderstood. But the love they built was rooted in honesty. One afternoon, months later, Theo found an old copy of a short story he had written during his internship. Scribbled across the top in her handwriting was a note. "You see people beautifully. Don't stop." He handed it to her. "I kept this." She smiled, running her fingers across the faded ink. "You always saw me too." "Even when I didn't. No, I needed it." They didn't talk about fate or destiny. Just timing. And how sometimes the right person shows up in the wrong season and returns when the time is right. In a small house near the woods where they eventually moved together. Mornings smelled like coffee and ink. Afternoons sounded like laughter and the clicking of keyboards. And evenings were quiet, filled with long dinners, shared stories, and the kind of kisses that ask nothing and offer everything. Lila never expected to fall in love again. Theo had once trembled beneath the weight of admiration for her. Now he held her with strength, not of dominance, but of understanding. And she had wrapped her heart around him anyway, because sometimes love doesn't come when you're certain. It comes when you're open, and that's when it finally stays. The first winter they spent together was quiet. Not lonely, just hushed. Like the world was asking them to slow down and take notice of what they were building. Theo had started writing again. Not because he had to, but because something about waking up beside Lila made the words feel alive again. She'd sit across the table in the mornings, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea, reading while the dog rested by her feet. She didn't interrupt his silence. She honored it. And in doing so, he discovered he didn't need to be alone to create. Some nights, they'd lie in bed long after the lights were out, telling each other small stories, memories neither of them had ever said out loud before. He told her about the time his father left and how he started writing because he needed to make sense of silence. She told him about her first heartbreak, not the messy divorce, but the quiet college romance that ended because she was afraid to ask for what she needed. They didn't always agree on things. She liked her space. He liked to talk through everything. She found comfort in long stretches of stillness. He found peace in routine, but they listened. They adapted. They forgave in real time. One evening, as the snow began to fall outside their window, Theo lit candles around the living room and read aloud from a poem he'd written. Lila, curled into the corner of the couch, listened with her whole body. "You wrote that today?" she whispered after he finished. He nodded. "I think it was about you." There were no grand declarations. No need for drama. Just the way her eyes softened and how she reached for his hand and held it to her chest like it had always belonged there. They started making small traditions. Saturday pancake mornings, handwritten notes left in random places, and Sunday walks to the bookstore where Lila would always insist she wasn't going to buy anything and always left with 2 paperbacks tucked under her arm. One afternoon, they were rearranging furniture in the office. Lila pulled an old storage box from the closet and sat, cross-legged, to sift through it. Inside were fragments of the life she'd lived before him. Photographs, ticket stubs, a birthday card she never sent, a letter from her ex-husband she had forgotten she kept. Theo didn't ask. He just sat beside her. "I kept too many pieces," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You kept what mattered to you at the time. I think I was afraid to forget who I was." He looked at her, soft and unjudging. "Then let's make new pieces." She turned toward him, suddenly overwhelmed by how safe she felt. How fully seen. And for the first time in a very long time, she realized she didn't feel like she had to protect herself and love anymore. She could just love, freely, fully. That night, they danced in the living room with no music playing. Just the rhythm of their breathing and the sound of the fire crackling in the background. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't plan the future. They just held each other and let time move around them. There were hard days, too. Days when writing didn't come easily. Days when old wounds made her retreat, or when his fear of not being enough resurfaced. But they faced those days together. Not perfectly, but patiently. One spring morning, Lila woke up before him. She sat by the window, the light hitting her hair like something holy, and wrote in the margins of a book she'd read a dozen times. Theo stirred behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You're up early." She turned, smiling. "I didn't want to miss this. The light's perfect." He watched her for a moment, then joined her by the window. She leaned into him. "Do you ever wonder how this all happened?" "All the time," he said, "but then I stopped wondering because I'm just grateful," and she was too. Grateful that time had been for them. That something once temporary had become lasting. That what began as admiration had turned into respect, and then into something deeper, into love that chose them both, again and again. Years later, they would still walk past that bookstore. Still argue over who made the better pancakes. Still leave notes tucked under each other's pillows. And every once in a while, when the snow returned and the candles flickered like they did that first winter, Theo would pull out that old poem and write it again, just to remind them of how far they'd come. Because love, when it's real, doesn't ask you to be anything other than yourself, Dot. It just wraps around you, Dot, and stays. Later that summer, they took a trip to the coast, Dot. It was spontaneous. The kind of idea that starts with, let's just drive, and ends with bare feet in sand and wind-tangled hair. They rented a small cottage with creaky floors and a view of the ocean. No agenda, no emails, no obligations. Just time. Theo wrote in the mornings, his notebook resting on the windowsill, salt in the air. Lila explored the trails nearby, sketching in her journal and picking up smooth stones she thought looked like thoughts, quiet and curved at the edges. At night, they cooked together with music playing low in the background. They danced barefoot across the kitchen tile, bumping hips, laughing, burning the garlic bread once or twice, but never minding it. Somehow, everything felt easier there, lighter. One night, after dinner, they walked down to the beach. The tide was low. The stars were bold, unfiltered. She leaned her head on his shoulder as they watched the waves roll in. I used to be afraid of this, she said quietly. Of something lasting. I thought if I let myself want it, it would disappear. I know, he said. I used to think I wasn't allowed to have it. They stood there a long time, the sand cold between their toes, the past somewhere behind them, not forgotten, but no longer holding the weight it used to. Back at the cottage, they sat wrapped in a single blanket on the porch, drinking tea, hands intertwined. She traced his knuckles with her thumb and whispered, Do you know how rare this feels? Every day. She paused. I don't want to need you. He turned to her gently. You don't have to, just choose me. She nodded, pressing a soft kiss to the side of his hand. Every day, she said, echoing him. When autumn came, they planted a garden behind their home. It wasn't perfect. They argued over where to place the beds, what vegetables to try. But slowly, something green began to grow. Theo started teaching creative writing at a local college. He came home each night with stories about his students, the shy ones, the wild ones, the ones who reminded him of himself. Lila started painting again, just for herself. She set up a small studio in the back room, light pouring in from the window, brushes drying by the sink. Their life was not exciting by the world's standards, but it was rich. Every shared glance over dinner, every small I'm proud of you after a long day, every quiet Saturday morning layered, like brushstrokes on a canvas neither of them had imagined painting before. Sometimes they made love, slowly like poetry read aloud under soft light, not rushed, not planned, just deeply felt. Other times it was urgent, the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with bodies and everything to do with being seen. And afterward, they'd lay there tangled up in each other, the silence around them full, not empty. Never empty. Love for them wasn't about fire anymore. It was about warmth. About choosing the same person in every ordinary moment, about folding laundry together while laughing at nothing, about staying up too late watching a film they'd already seen twice, about holding each other when grief surfaced, old or new, and knowing they didn't need to fix anything. Just stay. Years passed, not without hard days or doubt or long stretches of quiet, but they learned to navigate those too, not with grand gestures, but with small ones. A warm mug placed in the other's hand before they could ask, a note in a coat pocket, a touch to the back at just the right moment. They grew older, softer in the places that used to be sharp, stronger in the places they used to hide. And through it all, they stayed not because they had to, but because they never stopped choosing each other. Again, and again, and again. Winter returned, blanketing the world outside their home in quiet white. The garden slept beneath the frost. The windows gathered condensation, and inside, everything felt softer. One evening, the power went out during a storm. Candles flickered in every corner of the house, and Theo built a fire in the fireplace while Lila gathered extra blankets. There was no sound but the hum of the wind and their breathing, a familiar kind of stillness that wrapped around them like an old friend. Lay on the floor in front of the fire, their fingers brushing occasionally as they talked. "I think," Theo said slowly, "this might be the happiest I've ever been." Lila turned toward him, her voice gentle. "Not because everything's perfect, though. No, because you're here and I'm me, and nothing feels like pretending." They stared at each other for a long moment. No rush, no pressure. Just a shared knowing. The kind of knowing that only time and truth can carve out. When they finally kissed, it was with the weight of everything they'd been through, the early hesitation, the distance, the rediscovery, the growth. Every touch was filled with quiet reverence. Every breath was permission to be open, whole, vulnerable. They undressed slowly, not because of nerves, but because they wanted to remember each moment. The soft drag of skin against skin, the warmth of familiarity that still thrilled like the first time. They made love in front of the fire, wrapped in each other's warmth. The flames flickered, shadows dancing across the walls like memories. It wasn't hurried or tentative. It was passionate in the truest sense, not just desire, but devotion, depth, the kind of love that aches in the best way. She whispered his name like a promise. He said, "I love you," like it was his first language. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the rug, her head on his chest, his arm curled protectively around her. Outside, the storm began to ease. Inside, everything was still ... hold ... love ... She lifted her head and looked at him, his eyes glassy with tenderness, his mouth curved in a smile only she ever got to see. "Do you think," she asked softly, "this is what forever feels like?" He nodded, pressing his lips to her temple. "I think forever feels like choosing you over and over, even when it's hard, especially then." And she smiled, kissed him again, and let her heart rest fully in his, not because she had to, but because she'd finally found the place it belonged.